We had a wonderful first day, and I know that today will not disappoint. My name is France Blondin. My pronouns are she, her, elle, and la. I'm a student and in my final months of my BA BAPC program here at Royal Roads University. I am connecting with you today from an unceded territory. Some may know it as Ottawa, Ontario. This land that my home is built on, that my children play on, and that I have the privilege to enjoy every single day is not my own, but belongs to the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, whom have nurtured the land and cared for it before time immemorial. Since we're meeting from different places today, I encourage you to reflect on whose land you work, play, and learn on. So a few housekeeping rules or items before we begin. Today's session will be 45 minutes, 30 minutes for the presentation and 15 minutes for questions at the end. All mics and cameras are off, so please use the chat function to ask your questions. I will be gathering questions that you pose throughout the discussion, and at the end, I will be asking you questions to the speaker today. So in today's session, exploring the ethics of public war memorialization, challenges and opportunities, Dr. Jeffrey Bird will be engaging us about the role of cultural memory in the form of remembering, forgetting, and silencing, and the ways the past is used in the present. Dr. Bird is a professor at the School of Communication and Culture here at Royal Roads University. He's also the project lead for the War Heritage Research Initiative. He has written, directed, and produced 35 short and long documentary films, focusing on sites of memory linked to the world wars and local storytellers. His most recent journal article is called The Architecture of Memorialization, the Spitfire and the Making of a Memorial Icon. And I will put the link to that article in the chat today. So without further ado, Dr. Jeffrey Bird, all yours.
Okay, thank you, France, and welcome everyone. We have 30 minutes together, so I'll dive right into my presentation on the ethics of public war memorialization, challenges and opportunities. Just jumped ahead. We're working off a PDF here, so I'm just making sure that's all okay as we move along. I'll also just take a moment to acknowledge the territory, the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, the Songhees and Esquimalt, on whose territory I live, learn, and remember, and the Lekwungen and Wasanic peoples whose historical relationships with this land continue to this day. And I think it's important to start here because right away we see the importance of land, of place in our lives today. And when we recall the past, we are really speaking about an attachment to our present day identity. And when we speak about war memorialization, we are really working with the past and how it informs our world as well as our own identities today. Okay, so I will just provide this warning to say that the presentation does deal with topics associated with war, violence, and death, and its memorialization. And I know this can be difficult for many viewers, and so I'll do my best to approach it in as ethical way as possible. And yet I just wanted to provide this warning in advance for the topics we'll discuss. And we start here. Probably one of the most well-known Canadian memorials that we have, and it just happens to be overseas. It's the Vimy Ridge War Memorial, and it's in France, just north of the town of Arras, and it is a powerful place. I was a guide there long, long ago, and one of the things that we would do when we would take people around the what is a national park is to focus on this particular set of allegorical figures that are placed at the top of the memorial. And these are various figures that, and I just can't quite see the top of I'm trying to get rid of this floating thing here, but people are still coming in, so I can't exactly stop that. But these are the allegorical figures that speak to virtues that Canada and France share. Virtues such as charity, justice, education, peace. And this is what Sir Walter Allward, the sculptor, wanted to convey with this war memorial that was to speak to this particular battle in 1917 that was part of the First World War. So we know this battle as, and it's grown as in legend as this moment where Canada became a nation, the coming of age of Canadians. And this legend is carried on over time. And yet there are people, and Noah Rieshler one, that actually argue that this is not a fair assessment of this history. And then he says that when Canadians tell the story of the Battle of Vimy Ridge as a creation myth, they tell it in a manner that prompts complicity rather than outrage. And what he's saying here is that when we use war as a way to speak to the birth of the nation, we're dealing with 10,000 Canadians that were killed or wounded over 3 days of battle. And so in his eyes, it is completely incredulous to even consider this as the birth of a nation. And other authors, such as McKay and Swift, spoke about this idea of the Vimy trap. The trap is to imagine a modern war in general, and this particular battle as adventures and manliness and nation building. It is the trap of assembling to an official, feel-good, complicated nation-building exercise, a profoundly untruthful and childish story about the war. I'll let you read those other sentences quoted from this particular book. And so clearly we can see here anytime we're engaged in any kind of war memorialization, there's a challenge. It is a complex discussion. And it's one that we get to explore today. In September 2023, so just a few months ago, the Western Front, so running from the Belgian coast right to the Swiss border, and all the scores of, and I will say even hundreds of cemeteries, memorials, including Vimy Ridge, were designated as World Heritage status. And they were designated as that because in the eyes of UNESCO, they represented exceptional universal value to the inhumanity of war and recognizing the part they play in the peace process, that the sites of memory become places of reconciliation, contemplation, and peaceful reflection. So this is quite in contrast to the view of the authors we've just read, and one that I believe is where we go when we talk about ethical memorialization. So today we're going to look at a few examples and challenges related to war memorialization and understand some of the conflicts, the challenges, the opportunities, as well as the complexities there. And talk to a few definitions and suggestions for further reading for you. I'll speak a little bit about my research area, but not very much. And then what I'd like to do is give you a little bit of homework for what is perhaps the most significant global commemorative event related to the Second World War, and that's happening this summer in June with the 80th D-Day commemorations. So that will be one of my main areas of focus when we talk about war as we walk through the next 30 minutes. Now, this is a topic that I had originally thought about, this idea of just not war memorialization, but public memorialization in general. War memorialization might be seen as a subset. And there are elements that I think we can learn from it that tie with these larger questions we're dealing with today in our communities, in our cities, not just in Canada, but elsewhere. And that is how we look at the memorials from the past, particular settler memorials, and we need to consider what is to be done. Now, this is normal through history. We see the removal of memorials and monuments all the time. And this is one that we are going through now. And it's, of course, a topic of public debate and one that's an important one for us to have. And so I'll task that with you. as we go along. And just to give some context as to why we would focus on the D-Day commemoration in particular, it's the 80th. So anytime we have a decade number, we have a significant rise in the number of people that participate. Public figures go, presidents, prime ministers speak. And as I mentioned, it's the largest commemoration of a battle in the world. Roughly 4 million visitors go to Normandy to visit the battlefields of D-Day each year. There are over 20 museums. There are over 500 memorials there. So we get to look at not only the tangible memorials, but also the intangible forms of memorialization. What is also useful here, whereas rather at the beginning when we talked about Vimy Ridge, and we talked about the conflict of how people interpret the First World War, we can look at the Second World War in the context of being a just war. Now, we may debate that. War is terrible. We're not trying to justify war. But as wars go, the Second World War stands apart from many of the wars that we see in the 20th century and in the 21st century. And so it possesses a certain mythic status that continues to this day, and it gets employed for a whole bunch of different purposes. I show a picture of Neil Stewart here, a veteran who passed away some 6 or 7 years ago, a friend of mine, a person that was able to tell stories of his experience in the Second World War. And of course, here's another reason why we're in a very interesting and important transition now, because we're stepping away from a time when veterans and witnesses were able to tell us about what happened. And now we're in a period where, we are on to the next generation, the post-war generations who are learning about. So this is where remembering in the first person becomes remembering as a means of learning about the past. So, quick history and very little of it. But just to give you some context for those of you that might not be quite sure what I mean when I say D-Day, Second World War for Canada from 1939 to 1945, a global war that involved nations and battlefields around the world. And this particular moment in June of 1944 involved Canadian, British, and American predominantly troops, or some free French as well, who landed on the Normandy coast and started what was to become the liberation of Europe. And so it was an incredible event in many respects. There were 5 beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau is the Canadian one, and Sword. We might know Omaha Beach. We'll speak to that one in a few minutes. 156,000 Allied soldiers landed on that one day. 6,900 ships, 5,000 aircraft. Half the landing force was Canadian and British forces. We often kind of get a sense that it was mostly Americans there. This is one day. We typically commemorate, and I'll say celebrate, this day on its own, but 80 days of battle followed, which were quite horrific. The liberation of Paris, the end of August. War ends in Europe, May 1945. But it's interesting because some of you, now that we've moved on from that slide, probably wonder, if I were to ask you in the exam at the end of this presentation, whether you remember how many people were participating or how many ships. That information just disappears. And Linenthal says, the facts of war are less evocative than the stories we tell, the heroes we venerate. And in this way, this is the power of memorialization. It's not so much the specific event, although we are aware of it, but it's the people that were involved that have an impact on us in our memorialization. And I share this with you, one grave amongst many at this particular site, and it's a Commonwealth War grave. It's a Canadian soldier. There's a Christian marker on it. So there's all these symbols that are telling us who this person is. But to me, the most profound is the valediction that's placed at the base of the grave from his fiancée, a beautiful future planned only to end in a dream. Dear, my thoughts are ever of you and what might have been. And I think when we go to these places, we may not care about nationalities involved or the war, the history element, but there is a story here that we all connect to, and that is the story of humankind. So what do we mean when we say memorializing? Something created or performed to remember or educate people about a past event or person and its significance would be typically what you'll find as a definition of memorialization. In this way, we might be thinking about the chunk of stone with the name on it that stays somewhere. And these are important. These are markers in the landscape that call on us or compel us to remember. But I would add this other piece that memorialization is not just these pieces that are dotted in the landscape, but it's the co-constructing of meaning. And I would say when we're talking about ethics, action between what is memorialized and the person engaged in the act of remembrance. So let's just keep that in mind as we walk through. We're not going to do a lot of definitions here, but it's important just to kind of cover some things that we're saying as we go along here. And so when we say how do we memorialize, well, there's all kinds of ways we are engaged in memorialization. It's not just those stones and bronze statues. We can think of art. We can think of intangible elements such as tradition, the things we say. Film is also a big part of memorialization these days. We can think about memorialization in the digital realm. And all of these may warrant their own attention, and we can only touch on them as we walk through this. But when we memorialize, we do it in so many ways. We can even think of street names that are examples of memorialization, as well as massive landscapes of war. So a little bit about remembrance, because memorialization links with remembrance. And there's some siblings with remembrance too, which we'll speak to, and those would be forgetting and silencing and even oblivion. But let's just think about, and particularly when we have this lens of memorialization, we can think of memorialization in two main ways. One is a public remembrance. And this is what you'll see in Normandy this summer. Here we have Ronald Reagan, 1984, probably one of the most significant speeches in his presidency in Normandy, June 6, 1984, where he marked foreign policy for the United States. We may see this this summer. So these public remembrances involve an act of public memorialization by a head of state, usually, certain rituals, specific sites of memory that have a gravitas to them, a power. And they often involve a messaging from the nation and in this way, we're speaking about national identity. Second perspective is more personal. It's about a family story we pass on. It might be a family story within a community or an organization. But it's important to recognize that the past is not simply there in memory. It must be articulated to become memory. And our challenge when we deal with memorialization involves working with the past material recalled now in a certain fashion. So it's something to do with the past, and we're trying to recall it in the present. And so it's difficult work. It's complex. Here's an example. Here's a tourist in Normandy at the Omaha beach. He's American. He reaches down to take a photograph here. And, one might think, okay, what's he taking a photograph of the sand? Well, this is some of the images that he's working with, the education he had when he was in school, the Robert Capa photos, powerful images of the landing at Omaha Beach. And that makes this place iconic. Here we have a scene from Saving Private Ryan, 1998, a film that actually shaped a new wave of tourism to this area. So films definitely influence how we understand the past. And so that's what's happening for this particular fellow. And when we think about memory and memorialization and our roles as the kind of the human receivers, we're dealing with imagination, emotion, memory, and I would add an ethical element, which would be some kind of action we should be considering, something that calls us to take action, to contribute. And so we see a lot of people that are affected when they go to this place. Here's a woman I met who is basically trying to understand her grandfather's experience and speaks to the whole thing of uh, being in the landscape and having that close connection with the past. But the ethical issues are quite significant. An interesting report out of Australia for the First World War centenary raised a whole bunch of key issues here. And these are always at work, particularly things like glorifying war. There's always concern between uh, remembering the fallen and avoiding the glorification of war. And so we can walk through different sites around the world about the politics of remembrance. This is a particular site in Sarajevo where the First World War actually began. The assassination of Archduke Ferdinand just happened just on the road beside, yet there was no service, there was no commemoration. Why? Because it's a difficult history to speak to. So much has happened between Serbians and Bosnians since that recalling something that happened 100 years ago just is something that's best kept silence to avoid the political discussion. Relevance. You see this, all the questions like that happened in the past. Why is it relevant to this day? Fascinating conflict we had many years ago with the Enola Gay, and a Smithsonian did an exhibit on whether or not dropping the atomic bomb was ethical. Was it moral? That led to a huge political uproar. A fascinating book written about that particular topic. We can also talk about dissonance in the form of people coming to have a good time and going to a battlefield where horror occurred. We can think about issues of profit. You can buy your D-Day coffee mug. You could buy the uniform of these soldiers as a hobby. These are all very complex issues, and they're not easily undone as black and white, right and wrong. And often, you have these little memorials. This is one to a Canadian regiment, the Regina Rifles, which is now lost in an industrial park. And so memory struggles to keep going in a lot of ways. And other memories that were once silenced have come to the forefront. So here's the town of Caen in Normandy, which tells the civilian story of how horrific the war was. So that's a story that has come up in recent years. Branding issues, how we tell this story. These are other ethical concerns. One suggestion was to create what was called the mythic sector. And what this did was essentially miss out on Canadian stories and British stories of the battlefield where Juno and Sword are. This idea was quickly dropped. But the idea of the mythic sector basically recognized the power of film, Band of Brothers, Saving Private Ryan, in driving so many visitors to learn the American story and not the other stories. Of course, we had the effort to buy land right by Juno Beach Center, the condo project. But luckily, the Canadian government bought that. So constant concerns and battles here. I'm noting my time, and I'm just going to quickly roll through here. How am I doing for time, France?
Good, actually. We still have another 20 minutes.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, good. So a little bit about research, and this might help us for those of you that are really interested in digging into this in a bit more detail. I present this image here. Hopefully the floating controls allow you to see it. This is an effort to just show the kinds of disciplines and subject areas that are part of a conversation around ethical memorialization This is a communications conference. So I listed a range of different communication theories and fields of study that might interact here and interact in this presentation. Um, when I say ethics, I'm talking about the actions we take. If we're to talk about a moral perspective, it would be the guiding principles or whatever we value. Keep in mind, for example, the virtues that are on the Vimy Ridge Memorial. That's a moral perspective. So those are the lens we use today. The side of memorialization is really linked in with topics of, we might think, history, but probably the larger player is memory. Cultural memory is woven in here. We can think about individual memory, as I mentioned. We can think about the memory of communities, um, of special social groups, and then the larger public memory that might be the nation. So we're not going to dive into any more detail than to look at this screen here, but just to say that, and too, when we look at the social sciences, we can think about cultural geography, anthropology, psychology. These are all important elements when we explore the topic of memorialization in any facet, be it war memorialization or public memorialization. But it's important just to note cultural memory and its significance as we walk through this, because it's the one that's shifting through time. And we can think about cultural memory in three different ways that are important for us. It's made up of historical events, mythologies, traditions, and cultural values from which we draw meaning as to who we are and informs or frames how we understand the past and the present. We are doing this all the time. We might think, well, I'm not really a big history buff. Well, our lives, the streets we go down, the arguments we get into, the things that we see on the television often draw on the past. The films we're watching right now. And in that way, this memory is dynamic. It's informed by historical events, but mass media plays such an important role these days in educating people about the past. And I'm not talking about just documentaries. I'm thinking about um, films that we're seeing, like Masters of the Air is on this week. The New Look, which is a fascinating Netflix piece on Christian Dior and Coco Chanel and their time in the Second World War. I mean, these are stories that are told to us through a Hollywood lens, and yet they might open a door for us to want to learn more from a historical perspective. But most of the time, we're also seeing commemorations, events, festivals, monuments as holding our cultural memory. Here's a few books that I would suggest if you're interested. And just by the way the PowerPoint set up, it gave prominence to Marita Sturken's book, which is probably worthy. 1997. These are books that are on my table right now. I always like Marita Sturken's work and her definition of cultural memory. She talks about the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington, D.C., but she also talks about the AIDS epidemic, which is a fascinating consideration nowadays because it raises questions of how will we memorialize COVID. Probably a topic we are just happy to just get as beyond as quickly as we can. But in another way, there's others that'll be thinking about how to memorialize the efforts of the health service, as well as those lives lost and changed. But other books here, War Beyond Words. This is Jay Winter, great historian who has written several books around remembrance. Death So Noble walks through the Canadian experience of memorialization after the First World War. And so you can see some public memorialization books here. How the Word Was Passed, Clint Smith, African American, speaks about learning about history of and through the memorials across America, the history of slavery, Canada's place names and how to change them. This is Lauren Beck's book. So this is action at work in a way, definitely, as I mentioned before, we're in a situation where we are importantly engaging in these discussions around memorialization, and there's delicacy here. So a few ideas there for those of you that are interested in reading a bit more about this. A little bit of my own positionality. So I did work at Vimy Ridge as a guide. It was a powerful place, and it was something that influenced me for as you can see by the work I do the rest of my life. I was in the Naval Reserve for a while as an officer, um, but I also did a lot of work in Vietnam, in poverty alleviation and community development. And those students there are standing in front of a B-52 bomber undercarriage in Hanoi. And so wherever I go, the kind of work I do, I find myself drawn to these very difficult histories, often contested. I run this War Heritage Research Initiative, which is a site for films that I've produced over time, and please visit it if you have a chance. Because, of course, the discussions go beyond just D-Day. Japanese-Canadian internment in the Second World War. That's another topic that I often find myself very much engaged with, focusing on the site of memory, the place that holds the story. And in this case, we're looking at Hastings Park, one of many sites that hold the memory, and a witness account, a person who was there, Mary Katagawa. And Moral Awakening, the piece about Canada's involvement in the making of the atomic bomb. And and the impact on the Dene people that are on Great Bear Lake. So these are important stories, and I hope that they stand as a form of memorialization and a call to action. I work with Catherine Palmer, and who's done so much work and has helped me so much in my journey on the power of the Spitfire, as a memorial. We can also talk about remembering as a human right. And this is an interesting idea that Jay Winter speaks to. And I've tried to do some work on this. Commonwealth War Graves Commission has done some excellent work in recent years to address the inequality of commemoration of African and Asian troops who were not buried to the equal treatment that was promised. And that has been a major focus in recent time to address that unethical practice. So these are things that are at play to this day. It's a very busy area, and it's complex too. And so I give you these questions here because there's a little bit of a homework towards the end when I send you off after this presentation. And there'll be another slide at the end here. But these are the kinds of questions that we have at play, as Stroud and Henson speak to. When we look at public memorialization and also in the context of war, we could say, why is this significant now? Is this the whole story? And that ties in with who tells this story and what stories are not being told. And so is this memorial teaching us something or pushing one lesson or argument on us more than others? What are we learning? Is it clear? How does commemoration lead to post-war reconstruction and reconciliation? What action does this inspire in me? So range of questions that can take us in different directions. So definitely memorialization is a dynamic act, and we should not view it as simple participants who are spectators to it. So war memorialization, to be ethical, it must inspire people to responsible action to achieve something in the present for the present. And I think this is what happens often when you go to Normandy. These trees were a project where children were able to come up with a phrase, essentially engrave it into a metal leaf, and that they put these trees up as memorials essentially to the future. But often when we go around, we can see lots of direction as to what is respectful, what is appropriate, what is ethical forms of memorialization. So this is a big memorial in the Somme known as Théâtre Val, 70,000 names to the missing. And it says, please help to maintain the beauty and tranquility of this sacred place by befitting conduct. So it gives us some room to maneuver as to what that befitting conduct is. But in other places, it might be very specific. And it's interesting when you look at this. So this is the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, very powerful memorial. And there's, before you walk down, before you descend into the memorial, there's these signs that tell you what to not to do. And these are, of course, connected to, or maybe a link to connotation of disrespect if you're eating in front of it, if you're smoking in front of it. And so there are some lessons, and some of them aren't really clear as to how a memorialization can be ethical when we're standing in front of something. But this is just to recognize that, symbolism is dynamic. It evolves over time, over generations, and it's something that we are engaged in. This meaning, we're engaged in co-construction. So that was a memorial we'd probably walk by. We probably wouldn't even pay any attention to it, that chunk of concrete. But in the distance, though, is perhaps one of the most powerful images I've ever had, which is at Juno Beach. It's children at the edge of the landing beach where Canadians came ashore. And so memorialization can be fixed, it can be formal, but it can also be in the acts of people and things we see. And the landscape is often so powerful. And I think this is what makes Normandy such a resonant place for people, is that we're on the edge of the water, and there's a mystery to it. And there is this sense of impermanence with the sand. And it's a place of solace. There's often chances to venture into the past with kind of a then and now practice, often with guides taking you to places and using imagery. So all of these are great and powerful ways that we connect with the past. Focusing on certain key themes is the Normandy American Interpretive Center: competence, courage, sacrifice. So they base their whole interpretive presentation around these themes that are universal. And in that way, we can reach kind of an ethical form of memorialization. How am I doing for time, France?
So we're running at about 7 minutes. So if you
Okay,
want to
perfect.
have a little bit of time for questions, there's a few questions in the chat.
Okay. So, okay. So do I have time after the 7 minutes, or should I be slowing down now?
In 7 minutes, we're going to be done for this session.
Okay.
So.
Okay.
Um,
So I'll just pass on to a few concluding comments here to give a little bit of room. There is a book about the sites of memory and guardians of remembrance that came out a few years ago that I was involved in editing and writing. So for those of you that are interested in more, but I would say that the opportunities around ethical memorialization could be about something similar to what happened at Vimy Ridge in 2017. And I looked at that because I was involved with that with the University of Toronto Education Department. We had 10,000 Canadian youth at Vimy. And on the 10th, the day after the actual commemoration, we had an expo where students came through and on their own terms engaged with big questions that we face in the world today. And we used the commemoration as a point of departure to talk about today's issues. And so I think that's what we could see when we're in Normandy. We're going to consider issues of reconciliation there in the European context, but perhaps there's some universal lessons that we can draw on. And that is just to recognize that we're all part of the evolution in how we remember war. And it can shape our actions in a positive way. So your homework. How will it be used to speak to foreign policy, to today's conflicts, and to climate change even? Like, you're going to see all of these things happening in Normandy on June 6th with speeches, the lead up, the activities that are going on, the commemorative activities. And we can look to see how youth are involved. We can see what criticisms are raised of memorialization and why. And what are the consequences of the 80th anniversary? Is it going to make a difference? So D-Day is just an entry point into the discussion and into discussions on reconciliation, but it's not a conclusion. And so this will be my final slide. So when we're thinking about ethics of memorialization, we might think about an idea of remembering well. Ethics is the appropriate actions or behavior. Ethical memorialization, therefore, involves responsible action, being aware of one's connections to war history, and we could also say to public history as well, building imagination, memory, and emotion in our teaching and learning, finding local sites of war memory to engage with history and physically connect to the past, and taking remembrance into an action that contributes to today's world. So I'll end there. Thank you very much for your time, and sorry for running into the question period.
Thank you, Jeff. That was great. A couple of questions. We have about 4 minutes. So I will read a question here from Jennifer. So she says, when considering that history is written by the victors, how does that affect discussions and memorials for those considered the losers or the aggressors of a conflict? Is it considered appropriate to memorialize those who perished defending what they believed was just a cause for their countries?
Yeah, that's a big one, and when you go to the German war cemetery, it was a slide I had to fly by there at Le Camp. There was a specific attempt to take away the German context of the Third Reich, so rank, regiment, all that stuff was removed, and one is presented with the name of the soldier and his age, and in that way, the focus is on the human being, and there's always a concern with idolatry of the sites and Nazism. It certainly is the far right can sometimes use these sites for their own purposes. So it's often it is an issue, and I think those are the points. That's what makes memorialization dynamic, is that it's not fixed in our interpretation, and these are the questions we ask and the things we might engage in terms of our actions, is to raise these points, is to memorialize these people like the civilians, for example, who were affected by the war.
Thank you for that, Jeff. We have time for maybe one more question, and maybe the rest can be answered at a different time. They're all very great questions. Here's one from Catherine, where she asks, who decide what needs to be memorialized? What is worth remembering and why? I don't know if 2 minutes is enough to answer that one.
Yeah, well, I think that's why I tried to cut down my area, and you can see it's still a big topic. When we think about a just war, and we look at an invasion that liberated countries, it makes it easier in what is a very difficult thing to do. But what's happened in a place like Normandy is that families come or communities come and they go, you know what, this is such an incredible story. I want to put a memorial here too. I want to pay to rename a street where my mom was a nurse, where my father fought as a private. And so there has been this wave, a kind of a democratization of memorialization, to the point where it's a sea of too many memorials, 500 memorials. So, there is this whole situation of trying to create memorials that speak to more than just a nation. And I think that's the evolution that we see in memorialization. When you look at the First World War, you're seeing trees planted, trees that represent a location where something happened, not a national identity. And in the European context, there has been that move towards stepping away from kind of more of a jingoistic approach. Whereas it is important to recognize, what a nation did. These are issues that prevent us from coming together.
Great answer, Dr. Bird. So that wraps up today's session. It is now, I was going to say 12:45, but that's my time, 9:45 for those out on the West Coast. So I want to thank you, Dr. Bird, for your time today and your insights on ethical memorialization. And I told you I had a hard time with that word. My French just doesn't, it's just difficult for me to say for some reason. But yes, thank you for your time today. Thank you everyone for your participation and attendance and all your great questions. So we'll take a 15-minute break. If you're anything like me, it might be up to your second or third cup of coffee. Go grab that coffee, but come right back because our next session, starting at 10 a.m., is called Equity and Environmental Beliefs with Emily Kennedy. So it should be a great one. So thanks again, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.